35 years ago, I started doing some research with my best friend, Bob Levinson, because our relationships with women weren't working very well. So unlike the self-appointed gurus you'll see on afternoon television, we really didn't know anything about how to get along with women.
I don't know what's next, and that's why I need you to leave. I'm very busy trying to discover a new style.
So we started this research really hoping that eventually we'd learn something that would help us in our relationships. And we really had no hypotheses. I always think about Isaac Newton, the great physicist, who once said, non fingo hypotheses. I do not frame hypotheses. So I thought that was pretty good as a start. So Bob and I really brought to the field of the study of relationships colossal ignorance and awareness of our ignorance. So we started doing research by building a laboratory where couples could come at the end of the day and just talk about how their day went after they've been apart for about 8 hours. And while they were talking to each other, Bob Levinson had a computer that in the 1970s was able to synchronize the video time code to the physiological data we collected. So as couples talked to each other, we were measuring simultaneously their heart rates, their blood velocity to various parts of their body, how much they were sweating from the palms of their hands, and we even put a little meter under their chairs called a jiggleometer to measure how much they jiggled around. Now, why did we do these things? We had no idea. We just thought it would be kind of fun. And we had couples talk about an area of continuing disagreement, a conflict that they had, and then a positive topic. And then we showed them their videotapes and asked them to turn a dial that told us what they were feeling, and we interviewed them about specific moments that we didn't understand at the time, asking them what they were thinking and feeling during these moments. And when I came to the University of Washington 23 years ago, I built an apartment laboratory, which was sort of like a bed and breakfast getaway setting on the medical school campus, and it's on the Mount Lake Cut. All these beautiful boats were going by, and we tried to make it as much as we could like a bed and breakfast getaway, except there were 3 cameras bolted to the wall, and couples wore Holter monitor measuring 2 channels of electrocardiogram. And when they urinated, we took a urine sample to measure stress hormones, and we took blood from them to look at the immune system. And people were coding their facial expressions in the control room. But aside from that, it was a very relaxed bed and breakfast kind of setting. About 20 years into this research, my friend Bob came to the University of Washington to give a talk, and the professor I was collaborating with asked, how can all this research help couples? And Bob said, I'm proud to say in the 20 years that John and I have been working together, we've never helped anybody. And that was true. We were really getting paid to watch couples deteriorate and making a living at it. So we really did a series of research studies trying to look at the masters of relationships, the ones who really stayed together, didn't get divorced, and were pretty happy, more or less. And the disasters of relationships, the ones that broke apart, and the ones that stayed together and were unhappy as well. Bob and I also studied gay and lesbian committed relationships for 12 years in this 35-year period. And we really were able to study couples across the whole life course. In fact, we're just completing a study in the Bay Area now that we started 20 years ago with 2 groups of couples, a group of couples in their 40s and a group of couples in their 60s. Our oldest subjects are now in their late 80s. So we're just finishing this. And across the whole life course, we've looked at transitions to becoming parents, what happens when a baby arrives in the relationship, how does it affect the relationship, how do relationships affect babies. And we found to our great surprise that we could predict, as we followed couples over many, many years, with over 90% accuracy, what would happen to a marriage by just observing couples in our laboratory. And I think nobody was as surprised by these findings as Bob and I were, because at the time, psychologists really weren't very good at predicting individual behavior. And the people who were on our tenure and promotions committee really said to us, if you can't predict one person's behavior, how can you predict 2 people? You'll square the amount of uncertainty. But it turns out that relationships have an enormous amount of stability, so that even from the first 3 minutes of our conflict discussion a couple is having, we can predict 96% of the time how the entire conversation will go. And from the conversation, we can predict with high accuracy whether a couple will get divorced or not, how happy they'll be, And in fact, one of my graduate students, Allison Shapiro, who studied couples in the last trimester of pregnancy, was able to predict the child's temperament and the child's neurological development and reduce 50% of the uncertainty in looking at the first 3 years of the baby's life, just by looking at how the parents argued in the last trimester. So we found an enormous amount of predictability. And what I'd like to do in the short time I have available is to just go through giving you an idea of what we learned and how we understand this. So I think that Bob and I were kind of like the early astronomers who looked at the heavens and tried to see patterns in the motions of stars and planets. And indeed, there were patterns that could be understood that the early astronomers looked at, and Ptolemy, of course, is known for over 1,000 years having been able to predict lunar eclipses and very accurately predict the placement of stars and the planets and the moon. But he didn't know why. He didn't understand why it worked that way, except to say that, as Aristotle said, the heavenly planets must move in the perfect circle, which turned out not to be true. So our first question was, could we find any patterns that discriminated the masters from the disasters of relationships? And second, what theory could we develop to understand those patterns? And only when we developed that theory were we able to design interventions to help people. And so these are all scientifically based interventions that my wife, Julie Gottman, Dr. Julie Schwartz Gottman, and I designed together. And she's the one who's really concerned about helping people. So that's what led to the Gottman Institute. So let me tell you how we were able to discriminate the masters and the disasters of relationships. When I was in graduate school, there was a book that came out called The Intimate Enemy. It was written by a guy named George Bach. And his idea for helping marriages was that the problem in marriages, he said, was that people didn't air their resentments. So we had partners face one another and take turns telling one another what they resented about each other. And he even designed these foam rubber bats that he manufactured called batakas, and they would take turns whacking each other with one of the bats. I really resent you didn't take out the garbage, whack. And then, I really resent that we don't have sex anymore, whack. And they go back and forth. And that was kind of the state of the art when I was in graduate school. And after hundreds of research studies, we've now learned that when you do that, people leave more resentful than when they came in. There is no catharsis effect for anger and resentment. And basically what Bob and I found was that what discriminated the disasters from the masters of relationships was that the masters were really very gentle with one another, even when they raised an issue. They raised it as if it was kind of an invisible soccer ball that they were kicking around together. They took responsibility for even a small part of the problem. Whereas the disasters really pointed their finger at their partner and were critical, and their attitude was that they were kind of diagnosing their partner's personality defects. And they wanted to be really appreciated for that by their partner. And they were hoping that their partner would respond by saying, "Thank you for pointing out all the ways in which I am failing as a human being. Can we have lunch next Tuesday so we can talk about this some more? You are such a wise person, John. Thank you so much." Unfortunately, criticism, which is stating the problem in the relationship as a defect in the partner, leads to the second predictor we have of what predicts relationships' demise, defensiveness. And defensiveness is any way of warding off a perceived attack. But unfortunately, the masters do the opposite. They say, "Interesting. That's an interesting point. Tell me more about what you see as our problem and how I contribute to this." The disasters become defensive and say, "It's not my fault, it's your fault." And they raise something that's a counterattack rather than responding by saying, "Interesting point, tell me more." Or they whine. They present themselves as an innocent victim. So we saw a pattern in the way conflicts begin. Our best predictor of relationship demise was a behavior we call contempt, which is any statement you make to your partner from a superior place. And if you think you're more punctual than your partner, more intelligent, more knowledgeable about something, or a better parent, or cleaner, or tidier, then usually what you say is really speaking down and has an air of superiority. And I collect these ways of people being superior. You know, some people collect stamps and some people collect coins. I like to collect ways that people can be contemptuous. The most common way we found was direct insults and name calling people a jerk and an idiot, saying what they're saying is ridiculous. But one of my favorite ones is correcting somebody's grammar when they're angry with you. I think that's a really effective way of being contemptuous. So if my wife says, I could care less about that, I would say, hold on there, honey. It is not I could care less. It is I couldn't care less. That's the right way to say it. Now, what was your point? So it's one of my favorite ways. So contempt is our best predictor of divorce and breakup in same-sex relationships as well, and also a predictor of how many infectious illnesses in the next 4 years the recipient of contempt will get. So it's been shown that contempt is a very wide spectrum downregulator of immune functioning. The final predictor that discriminates the masters from the disasters during conflict we call stonewalling, which is basically listener withdrawal from the conflict. And the stonewaller basically doesn't give the usual cues a listener gives, like head nodding, eye contact, brief vocalizations, and facial movement. That could be, Oh, interesting, The stonewaller is really tuned out, like a stone wall. But when we try to predict stonewalling from our data, from our stream of interaction, we found that an elevated heart rate above the intrinsic rhythm of the heart, around 100 beats a minute, predicts stonewalling. And in heterosexual relationships, 85% of our stonewallers were guys. Now, do lesbians stonewall? Absolutely, they do. So it's not biology. So we interviewed stonewallers about these moments. It turned out what they were trying to do was really calm down and not make the interaction worse. So the internal monologue of a stonewaller was something like this. Okay, just don't say anything. Let her burn herself out. How long can this last? 10 minutes to the game. She can't touch me then, That was the hope anyway, of the stonewaller. Now, guys who are in master relationships stonewall, they did, but they were able to self-soothe physiologically. So we had these basic findings that discriminated the masters from the disasters, but they didn't help us in understanding it. So you have a diagram here in your handout that looks like a house. By putting together the data that we had, looking at couples over long periods of time, we discovered that one of the most important discriminators between the masters and disasters of relationships was the ability to repair interaction. That in fact, in all relationships, regrettable incidents and arguments that go out of control and hurting your partner's feelings are inevitable. And one of the contributions Bob and I wound up making was that we wound up studying really good relationships. And before this research, therapists really had to fantasize about what a good relationship would be like. Oprah Winfrey hasn't had one, for example. And Dr. Phil just got divorced. So, we don't know, these guys don't really know what a good relationship is like from their own experience. And we were able to do that by doing research on good relationships. And every relationship experiences conflict and periods of alienation. But the difference between the masters and the disasters is they're able to repair. Being able to say, I'm really sorry. I blew it that time. That didn't go very well. Can we talk about it? And what we thought was that maybe the way the repair was made would make an enormous difference. And for several years, we looked at the nature of repair, and we discovered that we were looking in the wrong place. It was really the recipient of repair that was the important person to look at. And what made the difference in repair working and being effective was the quality of the friendship in the relationship. Not looking at conflict, but looking at how people maintain friendship and intimacy and emotional connection. So the first 3 levels of the sound relationship house diagram, which is our theory of how relationships work and why our prediction was able to work, is really about friendship. And the great thing about being a researcher is you can't stay vague about this stuff. You have to measure it. So here's what we mean by friendship. The first level of the sound relationship house is called Build Love Maps. And we found that the masters of relationships really had a roadmap in their mind of their partner's internal psychological world. They knew a lot about their partner. And the fundamental process that allowed them to know that is asking open-ended questions. Not questions like, did you pay the plumber? But questions like, how do you feel about your career right now? Or how do you feel about injustice? What's your mission in life right now? How are you thinking about yourself as a mother? And how is that changing now that our kid has left high school and left home? Those kinds of questions are the ones the masters are asking. And they're remembering the answers, which is another part of building a love map. Now you laugh, but actually I've had a lot of couples in my office where one of them will say, I really don't know what you find erotic. And the other partner says, I've told you many times. And I say, here's a pen and some paper. Take notes this time. Try to remember the answers. So love maps is a very interesting thing because it builds a basic sense that your partner is really interested in you and knows something about you. And it's something a lot of people don't do, not because they're mean-spirited or have a psychopathology, but because they really don't know this information. And we teach people how to do this, and we have ways of doing it that are a lot of fun. And so building a love map is a process that anybody can do. It doesn't take a lot of skill. And yet you'll find, you might want to observe this, how many times even at parties, people ask questions. And you'll find that it's a very rare thing for people to do.
By myself, instead of laughing with the crowd. If I don't care to be part of their gaiety, they often say to me, don't be so proud. But how are they to know I'm looking high and low for love that used to be my own?
The next level of the sound relationship house we call building the fondness and admiration system. And that was very interesting because what happened was that in the disaster relationships, people had a habit of mind where they were scanning the environment for their partner's mistakes. They were trying to understand why they were so irritated with their partner and annoyed and alienated. And so they looked at their partner to see what their partner was doing wrong so they could help their partner become a better human being and thereby be happier. Whereas in master relationships, they were looking for what was going right and they were appreciating that. And they were building a culture of appreciation and respect and affection on a moment-to-moment basis. And changing that habit of mind from looking for what's going wrong turns out to be very critical, not only in couple relationships, but also in parent-child relationships. Very, very different when a parent is noticing what a child is doing right when the child is trying to learn something, than pointing out the mistakes the child is making. Very, very different performance patterns. So that was the fondness and admiration system. The next level of friendship is really what we call turning toward. And we found in the apartment lab that people were making these bids for emotional connection. They were trying to get their partner's attention. They were trying to tell a joke. They'd start off saying, okay, there's 4 lawyers in a boat, and then the camera would look at the other person, right? And some people would be maybe cleaning their glasses, and they hear this joke, and they just keep doing what they're doing. No response, right? And some people would say, yeah, okay, 4 lawyers in a boat, and we call that turning toward. And the no response we call turning away. Or sometimes people would give an irritated response like, I am trying to read, and we call that turning against. We studied 130 newlyweds, a representative sample in Seattle, and looked 6 years after the wedding that the couples who were still together, not divorced, had turned toward one another in the apartment laboratory, turned toward bids of their partner 86% of the time. The couples who were divorced had turned toward their partner 33% of the time. And we were measuring a couple of months after the wedding. So that was an excellent predictor, building this emotional bank account by turning toward bids. And bids are really ways in which your partner, a lot of times very subtly and non-verbally, expresses a need. a need for affection, for conversation, for interest, for emotional support. And when people really build an awareness of that, that's the fundamental process, then they start really building this emotional bank account. So those were the elements of friendship we could work on in our workshops, and we could train therapists to really work on in therapy, that build a positive emotional connection in the relationship that is the basis for repair during conflict, that makes conflict work, be constructive rather than destructive. So that conflict really can be a way that couples get closer to one another, and they can understand each other better. Conflict is inevitable, and it's really a mechanism for learning how to love one another better, because we all make errors. We all communicate badly, and that's par for the course in every relationship. So that's what friendship was about. Now, a surprising thing was that these three elements of friendship, love maps, turning toward, and fondness and admiration, were also the basis for satisfying sexual relationships, romance, and passion in the relationship. In many marriages, once people have a committed relationship, they appear to stop courting one another, and they appear to stop having romance. Now, this dimension of romance is very interesting. At a recent workshop, one of the couples in the workshop raised her hand and she said, "Could you please define romance?" And we opened it up to the audience, and we got maybe 30 different definitions of romance. And I asked my daughter this question. Now, she's 18, and she gave me the best answer, because I went on Google and tried to find out all these ways people defined romance, and none of them were very satisfying. But my daughter said, romance is an agreement that you make with your partner that there would be magic in your relationship, and it's a shared fantasy that eventually becomes a reality. I love that definition. So anyway, that shared fantasy that becomes a reality, the way we create magic by really cherishing our partner, is something that happens only when these first three levels of the sound relationship house, the components of friendship and intimacy, really are happening. And they're things you can build. They're not ethereal, they're measurable, and they're things that we can really teach therapists to build, and we can teach couples to build in our workshops. If you work on the friendship, you automatically are in the positive perspective, which is the next level of the sound relationship house. And what that means is that generally your cost-benefit analysis of your partner's character and the relationship are more positive than negative. So when your partner says something maybe in an irritable way, you don't take it personally. Whereas the negative perspective, people really have a chip on their shoulder, and they have that chip on their shoulder because they don't feel like this person is their irritating friend. They feel like this person is their adversary. And so they're looking for negativity. They're hypervigilant for slights and put-downs. And they distort reality and even see positive things as potential put-downs. So there's some research studies that show that if you're in a negative perspective, you tend not to see 50% of the positive things that your partner is actually doing in an evening as measured by outside observers. So that's what the positive perspective is about. Now, the theory is that the positive perspective or the negative perspective is the litmus test of the quality of friendship and intimacy in the relationship. If you have a chip on your shoulder and you're hypervigilant and hypersensitive for negativity in your relationship, chances are your friendship isn't working very well, and repair is not going to work very well. So the management of conflict will not work very well. Conflicts will escalate, and that's what allows us to predict so well. So what happens here is that people are in a state of hyperarousal when they start dealing with a conflict. So during conflict, the disasters of relationships at the very outset are hearing what their partner is saying, whatever complaint that is, as a personal attack. And their heart rates are going up. Many physiological systems are firing, and they're becoming flooded. So that they're in a mode of not being interested in what their partner's saying, but really guarded. And we call it, what the hell is this mode, rather than what's this mode. That's what makes conflict badly from the very outset. Whereas if you're really talking about an area of conflict with your friend, even if it's a tough area to talk about, then you're more receptive and you're more in a what's this, an interested mode, and conflict goes entirely differently. Now, we also learned that some conflicts are very different from others. And the conflicts where compromise seems unthinkable, are usually not about the topic that the couple is discussing, but really about the meaning of each person's position, the existential meaning. So for example, conflicts about money that seem intractable. And a lot of couples are arguing about money now with the economic downturn. We know a lot about this and how unemployment and job loss and economic hardship really predicts more stress and more conflict, particularly about finances and money. Most conflicts about money are not about money, and they're not about the budget. They're not about arithmetic. They're about what money means and the history that money has meant to that person's family in the past. And we can really have people talk not so much about the issue, but about their hopes and their dreams. And once they are aware of what those dreams are, we can resolve those conflicts usually 86% of the time in our workshops. So making life dreams come true is an essential part of these kinds of existential conflicts, but also really asking the question of what is it that you really want in life, and knowing that. And that's what this level of the Sound Relationship House is about. And the top of it is about the way people create a sense of shared meaning and purpose. Because when people start to have a committed relationship, they are really not just having a relationship with one another that's romantic, that has conflict, but they're really building a life together, a life with meaning and purpose and mission and legacy and culture and values. And unless they have the conversations they need to have that make those meanings intentional and shared, then they go through life really not building this very important existential part of their connection together.
We have time for a number of questions, so raise your hand.
Can you talk about the telltale signs of a relationship that will stay together but be unhappy?
Relationships that stay together and remain unhappy are very similar to ones that break up. They're just a little bit less intense. So they're quantitatively different, but not qualitatively different. People who stay together and are unhappy eventually lead parallel lives. And they go down this cascade of distance and isolation that we can describe very well. And eventually they're really living in parallel, but they're not very connected and very lonely.
If you had to name one thing that's the most important ingredient to a good relationship, what would it be? And then the second question I have is, have you looked at the chances of marital or relationship success being greater with two working spouses as opposed to one stay-at-home and one working spouse? And in addition to that, when children are brought into it, does that change the work or your findings?
Those are great questions. If I was going to pick one thing, and I was asked this question by the marketing director of Random House when he was trying to decide whether to put any money in marketing my book. He said, "Can you tell me in just 30 seconds what I should do to make my marriage better?" And I said, "I think the most important thing you can do is to know and honor your wife's dreams." And he got up and left the room. And turned out he went back home to Brooklyn on the subway. And his wife thought he'd gotten fired. She said, "What are you doing here? Did you get fired?" And he said, "No, I want to know what your dreams are." Her answer was, "I thought you'd never ask." So that would be the one thing, is to really ask these open-ended questions that are very deep and I think very respectful. And two people working, these kinds of things about what can you describe about people? Do they have common interests? Descriptive demographic variables about a relationship that will allow you to predict the relationship are generally pretty bad, because it really all depends on how people have the two careers and what they're really saying to one another. So for example, in studies of two-career families, what turns out to be most important is the perception of fairness. It's not fairness, it's not being 50-50, it's the perception of fairness. So it gets back to respect. If there's a feeling that you're in this together, that really makes a big difference. Now, the same thing is true about the effects of a baby on a relationship. Effects of a baby on a relationship, 70% of the time, are deleterious. So the majority of couples having babies in the United States are hurting their relationship. They're having less conversation, less sex, more hostility, and the hostility is transferring to the baby and affecting the baby's neurological development, cognitive and emotional development. And yet we can reverse those trends in 10 hours of a workshop. So once you know what to do, you can change this transition when a baby comes so that it can actually be an opportunity to get closer and build a stronger family rather than have it tear a family apart. And it's really all about dealing with conflict well, maintaining friendship and intimacy, and honoring the role of fathers. Because fathers have an enormous role to play in the development of daughters and sons. And the secret of keeping dads involved with babies is to have low conflict with mom and high intimacy with mom. So it's really something we can really change. And our effects are very large in the area of prevention rather than intervening when problems have really developed and are severe.
You find or study whether folks that had masterful relationships, whether they believe their parents also had masterful relationships and vice versa.
Generally, there is an effect of parents staying together and being happy. If they're miserable, it doesn't really do anything. Just stability. Very small effect. The really big effect is whether their parents have been happy with one another and have had their conflicts in private, not in front of the children. Because that raises children's blood pressure. It scares them. So it is important. A role model that we create for our children in our own relationships. That's one thing we say to couples who are expecting a baby is the greatest gift you can give your baby is a happy relationship between the two of you. So you're not depriving your baby when you go away for a bed and breakfast getaway and really have a romantic evening, an overnight. In fact, you're really helping your baby.
It's important to be repairing those relationships that need help, but it seems like we need to have more investment in training young people into how to become good spouses.
You're absolutely right, and we know how to do that. We have the instructional technology to make that happen. And it's in the work of a social psychologist named Elliot Aronson, who has really done all this work called the Jigsaw Classroom in training school students in elementary and middle school and high school to be able to work cooperatively with one another. And that emotional intelligence can be built, and we know exactly how to do it. Aronson's interventions have been effective on every continent on the planet, and yet hardly any schools are doing it today. So we know how to create this emotional intelligence, how to build the ability of people to really get along with other people, to deal with conflict, to maintain intimacy, but we're not doing it in schools. Instead, we're emphasizing just the rudiments and the basics.